Let's talk about how you will promote your podcast. And I'm going to explain to you the main promotional marketing strategy for a podcast.
This video is brought to you by Abhi Pai's Academy.
And what you'll have to do is see whether that's something that's going to make sense for you, and that's something that you're going to be able to pull off with the amount of resources and amount of the effort that you want to put into it. And it will inform whether this will be one of the elements which will inform whether the podcast is right for you, right? So here's how people do it. There's two phases. There's the phase of launch phase, and then there's like the ongoing phase. During the launch phase of a podcast, you have to have like a burst of subscriptions. So you email to your email list. If you have an audience, a big email list somewhere else, whatever, some audience somewhere that engaged is going to do what you want them to do. It could be even like a big list of friends. Get them to download, subscribe to your podcast and leave reviews. Reviews are going to be huge for you, because what you want to do, what happens is when podcasts launch, they want to be on the new and noteworthy of iTunes. Okay, when you are on new and noteworthy of iTunes, you get a whole boost of other subscribers just from that, from being on the new and noteworthy, and it kind of helps you to jump up the rankings in the podcast. Over time, once the whole like new and noteworthy thing dies down, you can always be like in the featured podcasts. But that's a harder thing to get into, because the featured podcasts are some of the top podcasts, right? So one of the things that really podcasters rely on is the SEO of podcasts, right? Wherever you are looking for podcasts, whether it's an app that lists the podcasts, a player for you, right, on your phone, or whether it's iTunes or anywhere else, there's certain SEO element, right? Let's say you want a comedy, you want to listen to a comedy podcast, you type comedy. If you want to listen to a business podcast, you type business, right? Or whatever other terms that you want to. So you have to think about, for example, let's say you have a comedy podcast. Well, in comedy, it's really hard to get exposure, right? Because there are so many good comedy podcasts out there already. So what you want to do is niche down. Something that's, of course, you can stay within comedy, but a niche within it. So maybe dirty comedy, or comedy for teenagers, or comedy for adults, or comedy for men, for women, X-rated comedy, not X-rated, like whatever, just something niche, right? So that when people make slightly longer tail, more focused searches, that's where they will find you, and you will have a chance to stand out and be number one or close to number one, because just in comedy, there's like hundreds already of really popular comedy podcasts, and you will be at the bottom of them. It will be very hard to get new listeners. It will be a struggle, right? So you want to find that sweet spot of just enough. And by the way, when your podcast grows, it grows, and then all of a sudden you're gonna start climbing the rankings of just the comedy keyword, right? And once you climb, and it's good, then of course you will get more downloads from that big keyword. But in the beginning, you have to have a sweet spot where to start, because you're behind everyone else. On day one, you're behind everybody else, and that's the challenge. And I see a lot of people struggle growing a podcast, in that they don't find a set of keywords for which they can rank that will get them the exposure. So how do you do this? Well, you have to identify the keywords that are right for your podcast topic, and then you can add them to the title of the podcast, the keyword field of the podcast, and throughout the description of the podcast. So that way you will at least position yourself well to rank for the podcast, to rank within the podcast search, so that people discover you. Okay, and then of course the other way to promote your podcast is if you have guests, you want to get guests with good audience sizes, so that when they tweet out or post on Facebook about your podcast, you want them to get you some traffic as well. So the more guests you have, the more traffic you have from that extra social sharing. But really the bulk of it is going to be about discovery and about you ranking and having visibility in the iTunes store. And the iTunes store is all about search in there and the recommendation algorithm, right? So people who like this podcast also like this podcast, that kind of thing. And in both search and the recommendation algorithm, it's all about the quality, the reviews, and you can manipulate reviews. You can ask a lot of your listeners to leave you reviews. That's going to be huge for you, right? If you can do that. And also, of course, the quality of the podcast, because iTunes like monitors, are people subscribing, are they unsubscribing, how many episodes are they watching, all those things, they monitor that, and they rank podcasts accordingly to quality signals like that. And of course, the keywords you choose, and over time you can change up your keywords to go more competitively. And that's really the marketing strategy for your podcast. If you want to go through all this, if you think your podcast is going to be, competitive enough, go for it, right? If you feel like you can get the reviews, you can do the SEO, then I think podcast, and really spend the time doing all this, right? Because what I explained just now, it's a long process. So if you want to do this, a podcast may be right for you. So those are just some things to think about whether to start one, really.